Well, as a preamble, before I do the introduction, I should warn you, when you bring back a retired professor, they'll take hours, but I'll try to keep it down a little bit. The other thing, of course, is that the audiovisual will obviously be dated. In 2005, Daniel Pauly asked me if I'd give a talk to fisheries about the history of fisheries, and I hadn't transferred all my slides to PowerPoint, so I had a slide projector, and I set it up, and Daniel's giving the introduction to me, and the slide projector catches his eyes, and he looks at me and he says, "This is a historical talk, isn't it?" So I hope that my PowerPoint, which is ancient, will be acceptable. I've actually agonized over the last month, seriously, about how to present the work of Ed Ricketts. This talk, I hope you'll see how rich it is, and sometimes you don't want to cut out a little piece and cheat anybody. But it also is because Ricketts doesn't really have a high scientific standing, and here I'm talking about his name in conjunction with intertidal ecology. And I hope that by the end, and especially after I read a quotation by a more eminent intertidal ecologist, that you'll be sold on Ricketts' importance. My own exposure to him, I think, is quite interesting because for most people who have gotten into marine biology, they had a similar trajectory. I remember when my brother came home, I was 14, and he had just checked out a book from the public library by John Steinbeck, and it was actually of mice and men, and we read it, and I liked it quite a bit, so I went down, and there's another one that was called Cannery, and I read it and liked it, so I picked up Sweet Thursday. Well, the main character in those two books, not of mice and men, but those two books, was Doc. Then I was in what they called AP biology in the States, and we had I grew up on the Oregon coast, we had a marine biology segment, and the teacher had Between Pacific Tides, the work that Ricketts produced, as a source book. So there's the name again, Ed Ricketts, and then this Doc from Cannery Row. I don't really know the association between the two. But in Newport, when I was a senior in high school, the Oregon State University built a marine science center, and the director was Joel Hedgepeth, who became the editor of Between Pacific Tides after Ricketts died. And I remember I had been working as a carpenter to get money for school, and I came into his office with my lunch pail after work when I had an appointment to see him. And I asked him, I said, you mentioned Ricketts and Steinbeck. What's the real relationship? And he starts talking on and on about how he's close friends with these guys and everything. And then he looks at me and he sees this kid, dirty from work with a lunch pail, and he said, "Wait a minute, who are you?" And so anyway, but the introduction continued. And then through graduate school in which I studied marine biology, Ricketts came up, or Between Pacific Tides anyway, came up. But it was usually in the context of professional marine biologists, and they would often disparage Ricketts as some womanizer drunk in Cannery Row, and he certainly wasn't educated in science, and on and on. Well, this was a mythical figure that was created by John Steinbeck. Then when I became an academic, I was in my first year teaching at the University of Washington, and we had what we would now probably consider an impossible teaching load, 8 courses a year, and I was to teach history of biology. So I started, creating new segments in biology, and the last one was history of marine biology. Well, that was esoteric enough, but I couldn't get 10 weeks worth of marine biology in a historical context, so I added a week called the Marine Biologist as Mythical Hero, with Ed Ricketts as a figure. Now, a few years before that, Joel Hedgepeth had published a series of manuscripts of Ricketts that had not been published before. So that was kind of interesting. But what was really interesting, that year was 1982, Hollywood produced a movie starring Nick Nolte as Doc and Deborah Winger as one of his love interests, and the movie was Cannery Row. Well, this added to Steinbeck's earlier versions of Ricketts, which really emphasized this role of Ricketts as a womanizer, loved alcohol, was disheveled, and quite a character. Recently, however, there's been a renaissance of interest in Ricketts that has revealed a different kind of individual. I don't know how many of you have been to Cannery Row recently, but if you had, you might have seen a statue to Ed Ricketts. A number of businessmen in the area affectionately call themselves Ed Heads. They have a lot of money, and they have sponsored symposia about Ricketts because of his relationship with Steinbeck. And believe it or not, tourists actually come and listen to these talks about Ed Ricketts and get a little different view on him. And then some of you may have read about this book, this boat called the Western Flyer that Steinbeck and Ricketts went on a cruise, and it sunk on the Swinomish Canal near Whidbey Island. It was refloated, and now to a tune of $4.2 million is being rebuilt as an educational vessel that they're going to take back down to Monterey. Now, I have to admit that the real driver of that is Steinbeck, but the work that they're doing is marine biological, so there is that tied in. Well, let me just mention real quickly, there's a series of works, and there's a British Columbia tie-in. Actually, there'll be a continued British Columbia tie-in here. The renaissance of Ricketts studies, if we will, was started by a graduate student by the name of Katie Roger, who came across a bunch of manuscripts. Now, let me back up and mention just briefly that you'll see pictures of Ricketts' laboratory. It burned in 1936 completely to the ground. So all of his letters, all of his correspondence, all of his notes, all of his manuscripts were destroyed. If that weren't enough, he and John Steinbeck, as I'll mention, got to be pretty good friends. When Ricketts died, as you'll notice, in 1948, Steinbeck was an investor in the business. He took his key and went down to the biological laboratory and took out all the manuscripts that they had exchanged and burned all of those. So the problem with reconstructing Ricketts' life is that for critical periods of his life and with critical individuals, the material was largely destroyed. But Steinbeck had other letters at home. That there were some letters with Ricketts, and Katie Rogers came across a lot of these and published two books, one in 2002 and one in 2006. One is of letters, and the other one is of unpublished and unknown manuscripts. And then the Vancouver-based science writer, Eric Tam, wrote a book called Beyond the Outer Shore, because Ricketts did a lot of work on the outside of Vancouver Island and up the inside all the way to Sitka and in Masset in the Haida Gwaii. So a lot of his work was actually done in this area, and for those of you who've looked at between Pacific tides, you'll notice especially marine forms around Sitka that he has used. And then finally, in terms of my own involvement, the MacArthur Fellows, a group of people that are supposed to be real smart, obviously I would question that because they invited me to organize a weekend gathering on Ricketts at Friday Harbor in 2002. And then there was an NSF meeting there as well in 2005 to evaluate Ricketts as a marine biologist. I finally will say that I did one of the reasons I was involved in this is I wrote a paper in 2002 on the history of intertidal ecology, in which I didn't mention Ricketts or between Pacific tides at all. And now I'm trying to right that wrong. So, between Pacific tides, which is Ricketts, let me just mention one other thing about this work. For those of you who've been into the intertidal area, you'll notice that there's a lot of things that are interesting about it. But one of the things is it's just so beautifully colored. I mean, it's a place that you stand back and you just see the black of the rocks and maybe the green of the algae, and you get closer and you see these fantastically colored organisms. It's really beautiful. There's an aesthetic dimension of it. And I always thought that maybe that was the way to look at Ricketts, was a person who appreciated the aesthetic role of science. But I haven't had a real good way of melding that in. But Mark Vesey mentioned this word, this notion of imagination, and it immediately clicked, because Ricketts wasn't a academic scientist, so he didn't have to develop ideas with experiments or a number of observations. He could just look at something and say, I wonder if, and then write those notions down. And today I will talk about two major imaginative leaps that then have been corroborated by subsequent intertidal ecologists. The book Between Pacific Tides, with Ricketts on your right, was published in 1939. It's gone through 5 editions, and it remains in print. It's Stanford University Press's largest selling book, over 100,000 copies. And I actually have the first edition, and I can tell you that it's worth several thousands of dollars. So, something's going on here that we need to understand. Well, to organize my comments, actually, maybe I have one other thing. Let me just add one other thing about the whole notion about imagination. I don't mean to be defensive about it at all, but it has a long and storied history in the history of biology, and although it's not discussed often that way. Charles Darwin, for example, had written an essay called the Essay of 1844, clever because it was finished in 1844. If you read that essay, you'll notice that all of his ideas are there. The Origin of Species wasn't written for another 15 years. And the problem that Darwin had is he couldn't imagine, or he couldn't understand, how if a species changed, how it could find a place in what they called the economy of nature, because nature was a plenum. And this vexed him until he did a project on barnacles from 1848 until 1854 in 2 volumes, which remains one of the best works on barnacle systematics to this day. And he was riding home one night in a carriage, and he said the idea just came to him that as these barnacles would diverge, it would create a new place in the economy of nature. That was an imaginative leap that he had. And then he published The Origin of Species. Now, this was not demonstrated by anything. He had some observational evidence that suggested that, but it wasn't until well into the 20th century that we understood how these variations can produce species change over time. So there are examples of imagination before. I'm going to use it in 2 senses today. The first, that it'll be more implicit, and that is Doc Ricketts was an imagined character. And I hope that by the end of my comments that we'll kind of just get rid of that imagined character and replace it with Ricketts as a biologist who relied on his personal imagination for some very important breakthroughs in marine biology. Okay, now for the setting of our story. Well, I'll just mention it. We'll have the setting first, and then I'll provide a cast of characters, kind of a dramatis personae. And then third, we'll look at the first imaginative leap, fourth, the second one, and then I'll make some brief concluding comments. For those of you who have spent a lot of time on the Pacific coast, you'll know it's incredibly varied. The number of habitats, that is the different kinds of physical features of the coast, are quite varied, from these rocky headlands that jut into the Pacific and are pounded by waves to secluded bays and estuaries where it's very Pacific. That's the only place that the word Pacific applies. In addition to that, there are equally diverse organisms. If any of you have been to the Broken Group, you will notice that they have probably one of the most diverse echinoderm communities or species in the world. Just take five, the idea of five, what's the word, pentamerously organized organisms, and they're there. It's just very, very diverse. That also has a characteristic that some of you may know. It's called mixed diurnal tides. Now, if you don't know about this and you live in this area, you have to know about mixed diurnal tides. In most of the world, especially equatorial and about up to 20 degrees north and south, tides are minimal. And in places like the Baltic, they're even minimal when they're in the 45 degrees and north. Tides are a combination of the influence of the moon and the sun and local geographical features. Normally, you have a tidal cycle because it's tied to the moon, of a 28-day period, and there are usually 2 highs and 2 lows. However, in the North Pacific, they have this mixed diurnal where you have 2 highs, a high high and a low high, and 2 lows, a low low and a high low. And the result of that is over a 24-hour period, the exposure to organisms, to the air, heat in the summertime, is quite varied. The Atlantic coast is not that way, and so that may provide an explanation for the patchiness and distribution of animals, but nobody knew that at that time. I might add that it wasn't until the late 30s that there were tide tables that were readily available for the entire coast of the Pacific. Usually the ports had tide tables, but a lot of the beaches lacked them, so you had to do kinds of calculations that, if you're like me and you're boating, you always miss the current because you've added or subtracted an hour incorrectly. Now, to demonstrate how valuable these characteristics were of the West Coast, at the end of the 19th century, it's when science developed in the United States first, and then the first generation of Americans moved northwards to like Toronto. J. Playfair McMurray was one of the first PhDs in biology in Canada, and he was one of the first PhDs from Johns Hopkins in the 1880s. But at the end of the century, in 1899, a group of zoologists at Columbia University was looking for a place that they could find interesting marine forms. So it indicates that already the East Coast was a little bit monotonous. And they had heard about the West Coast. And so they came out to Port Townsend in 1899. And from that point on, you can just see these individuals in May just migrating west to look at these interesting forms that you found on the Pacific coast. And remember, Nanaimo Biological Laboratory was founded in 1908, and it was part of the same thing. The first thing that they did was start to describe these organisms that were completely new to science. In addition, there were no taxonomic guidebooks Most of the species were either unknown, or at least they were very varietal forms of species that were known. But you couldn't just take a book out and open it up to echinoderms and find anything. The first book was this one. Now we'll come back to this one. The first book was this by Johnson and Snook. This says 1935 on it, but it came out in 1927 originally. And it was a taxonomic work. So it went from chordates to molluscans and so forth. And that was the popular organizational principle at that time. Well, another characteristic that we need to set the stage for is the characteristics surrounding Monterey Peninsula. The Monterey Peninsula is probably the most active intellectual community on the West Coast at the end of the 19th century. And that's because the Chautauqua movement, started in New York, came out, and for the first time, the first place they hit was San Francisco, and somebody said, well, if you really like San Francisco, you're going to love Monterey. They went to Monterey, and there's a thriving Chautauqua community in there beginning in the early 1880s. And soon, you know what California's like. Artists, intellectuals, and bohemians migrated to the area. It was really quite a thriving community. In fact, when David Starr Jordan, who was the first president of Stanford University, came out to establish a marine science location, he went right to Monterey Peninsula, and in 1891, Hopkins Marine Station was the first marine station established on the West Coast, and part of it was the compelling nature of the community. Okay, two other things I wanted to mention to set the stage is the role of marine biology in teaching at this time. At the end of the 19th century, influenced by Thomas Huxley in England, there was a major effort for people to move from studying biology in a rote way, that is, reading chapter 1, memorizing chapter 1, being tested on chapter 1, reading chapter 2, and so forth, to being educated in the laboratory or in the field. And the laboratory, what that meant was bringing specimens in and learning from that particular specimen. And this became the rage in the new colleges and universities in North America. As well, right after World War I, although there's mandatory 1 through 12 education in many states prior to World War I, it didn't become universal in the United States until after World War I. And the issue there again was to prepare students in high school for college, and there's a pressure as well to provide education based upon learning about organisms. So the use of marine organisms became a part of the educational effort at many institutions. The question is, where do you get them? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. And then finally, this is at the same time, there's the emergence of American ecology. And this started with Frederick Clements in plant ecology in the very early part of the 20th century, in which Clements argued that if you looked at the physical characteristics of a landscape, you could determine what the plants would be. It was a very deterministic model, and so, you know, if you have a certain amount of rainfall, a certain amount of fog, and a certain amount of windswept waves, you're going to have a spruce cedar forest along the coast. You move a little bit farther in, you don't have the salt water, you have a little more rain, not as much fog, and you get the fir hemlock forest. And you can do this all the way across the United States in a very deterministic fashion. A zoologist by the name of W.C. Lee decided that he wanted to apply these kind of principles to animals. Well, the problem with animals is the damn things move. So, you know, a tree won't be moving much except for in the wind, but just when you think you know why the deer is there, then it runs off to someplace else. So Lee found stream isopods, and these are little crustaceans, and they will fix to the substrate. And they fix to the substrate in relationship to the amount of current in the water. And so here you had a physical feature that would then explain why isopods were in position X rather than in position Y. And he called this the study of aggregations, organisms that aggregate together in particular physical characteristics. One of his students and colleague was a guy by the name of Victor Shelford, who, again from Chicago, came out, educated in the same Clementsian approach. And at Friday Harbor, where there was a marine station that was started in 1904, he came in 1906 and taught the first course in marine ecology in 1906, and then began looking for the similar kinds of parallels to what Ali found. And of course, the characteristic of intertidal ecology is that you have all kinds of animals that are sessile. They don't move. And so in theory, you could understand the physical characteristics that might indicate why that species is where it is. Okay, so that's the setting. Incidentally, the other thing that's always bothered me about this characterization of Doc Ricketts is that in 1920 and 1930, there was what was called prohibition. So what in the hell is all this alcohol flowing in this guy's life in 1920, 1930? Now, I understand laboratory alcohol, but there are some problems with some of the context in which Doc Ricketts is often depicted. Okay, let's see how far ahead of myself I got. Okay, now the local community. I'll just go through this rather quickly, and then names will come up a little bit later. Of course, there's Ricketts. Jack Calvin was a school teacher in Mountain View High School. He had gotten his writing degree from Stanford. And in 1925, the bishop in the Russian Orthodox Church in Sitka brought his family down to Carmel, that Carmel area. And his name was Kashavarov. And he had 5 daughters, and you'll see the Kashavarov women popping up. Jack Calvin married Sasha in 1930, and then Richie Lovejoy was one of Jack Calvin's students and was quite an artist. He ended up doing all the line drawings in between Pacific tides. Jack Calvin was Ricketts' collaborator, and he did all the photographs. And Richie married Tall Kashavarov. And then John Steinbeck was a struggling American author and ran into Ed Ricketts in 1930, and they became fast friends. Joseph Campbell came to the peninsula in probably early 1931. He's only there for 2 years, 31 and 32. But he became part of this group that gathered at Ricketts' house or at his laboratory and just exchanged all kinds of ideas. And as Ed Ricketts' kids told me, that there's always a pall of cigar and cigarette smoke, and somebody would always find a jug of wine from the paisanos in the area that they would share around. Of course, Joseph Campbell is well known as for his work in myth and the role of the mythic unconsciousness among groups of people, not individuals, but groups. Ed Weston, the photographer, was part of this group. Robinson Jeffers wasn't necessarily part of the group, but his poetry was front and center in all their discussions. And you'll see, there's a couple quotations that I'll read in which that's mentioned. In his book, The Roan Pony served as a inspiration for one of Steinbeck's novels, in fact. Xenia Kashavarov was the youngest of the 3 girls. She graduated from high school in 1931, I believe it was. came down with her parents. She was became a very well-known artist in the United States. And then she went down to Santa Monica to talk to a gallerist for some of her work. And in the gallery was a guy by the name of John Cage who was working there, and they fell instantly in love, married, and then she brought Cage back to Pacific Grove. And then last but not, this is an exhaustive list, there's Henry Miller, Tropic of Cancer fame. Well, if you have this group just hanging around the kitchen every night or every other night or maybe just even once a week, I mean, this is going to be an entertaining group of individuals. I might add right here that most of you probably, do all of you know who John Cage is, a minimalist composer? Many of you probably never knew that he was married to Xenia. He actually was married for only about 5 years, and then they moved back to New York. And one of the first people that John Cage met was Martha Graham. And he was kind of taken by Martha Graham. He had a roving eye. And but Martha Graham was interested in Merce Cunningham, who is from the Olympia, Washington area originally. But Merce Cunningham was interested in John Cage. So you had a dynamic that was really quite interesting. But ultimately, what's that? And Henry Miller wrote about all of it. Well, you should read the letters between Xenia and Ed Ricketts about the demise of that relationship. It's really quite interesting. I have a couple of pictures. Again, I apologize for the illustrations here, but because of the fires, a lot of stuff is just not available. So these are all from collateral sources of information. And that's Richie Lovejoy in the far left, and Doc, or Ed Ricketts as he was called. He wasn't called Doc. Preparing a small stingray for preparations. And then, of course, this is John Steinbeck. And so now this is a scientific community, and I'll go through this group. The WCLE, I've already mentioned him. He never was out in Pacific Grove, and in fact, Ricketts refers to him a lot and how much he was influenced by Ali. And the myth is that a mythic interpretation is that Ricketts took courses from Ali, which he probably did, but there's no record in the registrar's manual that he actually completed a course. But he did know Ali. W.K. Fisher was the head of the Hopkins Marine Station for most of the time that Ricketts was there. He retired in 1947. George McGinnity, some of you might know him from the time he spent up in Victoria. George was a invertebrate zoologist who was a Stanford graduate student, finished his degree in 1926, I believe it was. And then he is the one who introduced Ricketts to natural history techniques in collecting. They would go out collecting as far south as the northern part of Mexico, and as far north as Northern California above San Francisco. He went on to write a book about the Elkhorn Slough. So for those of you who've been down to Monterey, there's a big Pacific gas and electric plant, and the Elkhorn Slough is right there. And McGinnity has done a fabulous job of understanding the potential impact on that, and that's probably been the most observed power plant in the country. Torsten Geslin, and this is my only contribution to the whole thing. You probably noticed, actually, Mark told about my Norse roots, and Geslin is Swedish. He came over to Pacific Grove in 1930 and 31, and I noticed that Ricketts had referred to him a couple times, and so I just on a whim wrote to the archives in Lund, where he was, and they have a whole treasure trove of letters between Ricketts and Geslin, and that was a very important find. Willis Hewitt was a graduate student of McGinnity's, and then did a pioneering study on an intertidal transect from low water to high water, and wrote a paper that was published in American Naturalist in 1937, and then moved to Texas, and that was it. Angel Cabrera, I have him in parentheses because he never, I don't think he ever came up to North America. He's an Argentinian paleontologist, and he wrote an idea of what was called the law of mutual incompatibility in 1932. And this was basically the niche concept, but he didn't know of its nascent stages. Ricketts read of this in a biological abstracts in 1935, and it gave him another key idea for his thinking. And then S.F. Light was the Berkeley invertebrate zoologist, and so here's Fisher, this is McGinnity, this is Gesslin, Willis Hewitt, and then Joel Hedgepeth, the last of them. Now, Joel Hedgepeth is just about as guilty as Steinbeck in terms of creating a myth about Doc Ricketts. And part of that is Hedgepeth, who wrote a very, very important survey of bioecology, which he's very, very well known for, always considered himself to be a more important person than maybe he really is. And so he elevated his status with both Steinbeck and Ricketts, which meant that he borrowed Steinbeck's notions of Ricketts and then included them even in footnotes in the work that he wrote. And it turns out that most of it is just based upon the fictional side of Ricketts. Okay. So I guess we're now done with all the introductory thing. I think we're only 5 minutes into the talk. Yeah. So let me see where we are here. Okay. So Ricketts came to Pacific Grove in 1923. He met his wife Anna in Chicago. She was one of 13 children, I believe it was, from a Croatian family or maybe a Serbian family that had moved to the United States in the Pittsburgh area. And one weekend, she and a girlfriend decided to go to Chicago. They went to Chicago, and the first thing that happened to her, she met Ed Ricketts, and they fell in love. And in 1922, she was pregnant with their first child, and Ricketts didn't have any means of supporting himself, but he had a buddy by the name of Albert Gallagher who had an interest in starting a biological supply house to supply specimens for colleges and high schools on the West Coast, because that was an underserved area. And so the reasons that I gave earlier about why this was an ideal thing to do in Pacific Grove then now make sense. So they moved to Pacific Grove in 1923, and I hope I don't have to emphasize that Ricketts didn't have a university degree. He'd never taken a course in marine zoology, invertebrate zoology. He'd never been to the West Coast, never been to the Pacific Ocean, and he had never identified a marine organism. And he's going to start a biological supply house, and there aren't any guidebooks. So here's the laboratory, Pacific Biological Laboratory, and its logo. He began to, the initial effort was to collect specimens that schools could order as one-offs. Ultimately, he began supplying large numbers of organisms for, like, frogs and sharks for dissection, and a small hydroid called Gonionemus, which is very, very, has a very rich population in Washington and British Columbia. And so beginning in 1932, Ricketts began coming up into this area every summer with the kids to collect Gonionemus, and they would go down with thousands of them that would then be sold. So for those of you who took zoology when I took it, you often started on the survey of organisms by looking at selenerates, and Gonionemus is a perfect one. It's completely, you can see all the way through it, and so you can see the ganglia and everything. And that was, that dates back to the Pacific Biological Laboratory. Well, this is a place that Steinbeck, I forgot to mention Burgess Meredith, the actor, was part of this group too. Joe Campbell, Ed Weston, Henry Miller, John Cage began frequenting the laboratory. You can't work forever, and it had some large spaces and ideal place for these guys to get together. Here's a picture of one of these specimens, and again, Ed Ricketts preparing it. And what do we have here? Oh, another thing that was interesting in terms of trying to figure out where Ricketts got his ideas. So as I mentioned, he didn't know these organisms. So when he'd find one, he would get it identified either by running across the street to Hopkins Marine Station, and then he would put the name down and where it was found, where the identification. This comes from W.K. Fisher, and it has all its taxonomy listed. Now this note we know comes from a later period of time. The earlier ones were all burned in the fire, and so where you really notice it is on the side here where it says Johnson and Snook. It's on page 199. Ricketts and Calvin, which came out in 39. It's on page 274. Steinbeck and Ricketts, nothing, because that hasn't come out yet. And the Aleutian book, which would have been his third book, wasn't published yet. So we know that this is a rather late card. But these are what his specimen cards look like. On the back side, you'd have where you found them in the marine area and any kind of notes that you wanted to put on. And then if it was from what survey it was on. So these are the surveys that he planned to do every summer or every other summer in his quest to create these three books. If he couldn't find the correct identification, then he wrote to Waldo Schmidt at the U.S. Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. But he really relied on Fisher and S.F. Light at Berkeley, and another person that he wrote to quite frequently and is underappreciated in the history of science is a woman by the name of Libby Hyman, who wrote a 9-volume work on the invertebrata, which is still the best taxonomic work on invertebrates. And Libby knew everything about every marine organism there was, spent most of her summers on the West Coast collecting these forms. Well, the interest, here's McGinnity working on a tide, probably for shrimp or clams. And the interest of these individuals when they weren't collecting was how to make sense of this notion of marine associations, which Victor Shelford had written about. He had claimed that if you studied the intertidal life of the West Coast, that you should be able to identify certain associations that were cosmopolitan, that is up and down the entire coast. So was the Pisaster, Middleus, Balanus. So Pisaster is a starfish, Middleus is a mussel, and Balanus is the barnacle. And that those you should be able to find those associations all in specific habitats that were determined by certain physical characteristics. Well, George McGinnity, again, was taking Ricketts out all the time, and McGinnity says, I think that's a bunch of crap. Shelford just spent all of his time in San Juan Islands, then he goes back to Chicago. He doesn't see the coastline. And what we need to do before we make any of these generalizations is we need good natural history work. And So they're talking this up, these ideas up all the time, and then when Johnson Snook came out in 1927, now I've never seen the letter about this, but if you look at the conversation that these two guys are having, and saying, oh my God, here's another taxonomic book. We don't need more taxonomic books. We need books that are organized around environments, or what became known as habitats. And this got Ricketts thinking. We don't know when he started it, but by 1930 he had finished a draft, helped by Jack Calvin, of a book that was called The Intertidal Fauna of the Pacific Coast. And they actually sent it off to Stanford University Press to see if they would be interested in publishing it. Now, the reviews came back. They were rather middling. This is largely incomplete. The organizational principles are not clear. And I think it became obvious to Ricketts that he needed to understand a little bit more about the environment in which he was writing about. And one of the early principles of that fauna book was to look at the substrate. That is, if the animal is in rock or in sand or in mud, and did this change the associations at all? Well, now remember this Torsten Gesslin, 1930, 1931. From 1928 to about 1932 were the most exciting years intellectually in Ricketts' life, and probably in the life of all of these community individuals. If you look, I've listed when they were all together in Pacific Grove. Some may have started before 30, some may have gone later than 30, but they were all there between 1928 and 1932. Well, Gesslin gets there, and Gesslin had been working in Japan. Now, I don't know if you've been to the Baltic. Their tide, an extreme tide, is 20 centimeters. You don't really notice that very much. So Gesslin became incredibly impressed by the tides that he found in Japan, and then there they were in Central California as well. And he had some young children, as did Ricketts, and so the families would go on collecting trips together, and then Gesslin and Ricketts would start discussing the role of these mixed diurnal tides. Again, there we have them. And Gesslin left in 1931, and Ricketts almost immediately started writing a paper that eventually became The Tide as an Environmental Factor, chiefly with reference to ecological zonation on the California coast. I went through a number of the revisions, and the only reason we have it is that he sent it across the street to the Hopkins Marine Station, and everybody was marking it up. So when the fire consumed the original, there were about 5 or 6 copies of the thing, which we've now been able to extract. And we know that in 1933, as he was working on another revision, Ricketts all of a sudden has it, because he writes a letter to Gesslin, and let me see, he says, in May of 1933, he said, I also have finally, after several years' work, definitely solved the question of tidal factors with reference to the vertical zoning of shore animals on this coast. So zonation was caused by the tidal factors, and he figured it out. He didn't send him that paper because he was still revising it, but he sent Gesslin the paper in 1935, at the end of December 35, and tells Gesslin that he hopes that he can use the information in the paper for his own work on the role of tides in zonation. And Gesslin writes back in January, he says, "Thank you very much for your tidal paper, which arrived safely and which I have read with profound interest. The most interesting part of your paper is undoubtedly to be found in part 4, D through F, duration, interval, and frequency. That these mixed diurnal tides gives you three patterns of duration of exposure, interval of exposure, and frequency of exposure. Now, just what's interesting about that is Ricketts never got the paper published. But the book on tides in the North Pacific was written by Bengtsson. The most references in that book are to Ricketts' unpublished paper, and the unpublished paper is listed in the notes at the end. So clearly, it was an important piece of work. Well, the other part of that that he was working on, that Ricketts was working on, was a notion that he called wave shock. Some of you may have heard of that notion from Ricketts. Now, certainly, you see wave shock right in Pacific Grove. They have this little sea palm called Postelsia, which only grows where there's a lot of wave disturbance. But there's not, other than the Elkhorn Slough, there's not a wide number of environments there in which you see minimal wave shock there. Instead, Ricketts decided that he would take a trip with Calvin and Calvin's wife Sasha and Joseph Campbell on Calvin's boat, the Grampus, up from Tacoma, Washington to Sitka, Alaska, on the inside of Vancouver Island. And the whole purpose was to look at the different types of wave shock and its impact on the community structure all the way up. And so here's the Grampus. And incidentally, you see the canoe on top. Jack Calvin's in the door. The woman looking this direction is Sasha. Joe Campbell is the guy sitting under Grampus, and this is Ricketts right here. The other people, this was taken up in Sitka. But he and Sasha were married in 1930, and I know the women in this room would just go crazy over this. He said, honey, for our honeymoon, we're going to paddle a canoe from Seattle up to Sitka. It took them 53 days, and then it was an article in the National Geographic in 1933. So if you want to read an interesting adventure, and that's the canoe that they had at the top. So anyway, when he came back from this trip, I think I've got another slide here. Yeah, there's Calvin in the door of the boat, and Ricketts with specimens, and it's Campbell's back to us, and then Sasha. So anyway, when he came back, he started writing a second paper, and this was called Notes and Observations Mostly Ecological, resulting from Northern Pacific collecting trips, chiefly in southeastern Alaska, with a special reference to wave shock as a factor in littoral ecology. And what's really interesting about this paper for anybody, again, who's interested in marine biology, he samples all the way up to Sitka. So if you're ever out on your boat and you like to see if there's been any change in the community structure in, let's say, Refuge Cove, you just read this paper and it has all the listing. It's not wave shock as much as it's a definition of what the community structure looks like. And then at the end, he says, the reason you get this change in community structure is that all the way up the inside of Vancouver Island, you have protected communities from wave shock. It's not completely exposed. You get up to Cape Caution and it's exposed again. And then inside in the estuaries are what he would call estuarine communities without any wave influence at all. Well, we know that this is important for him because this led to a new title of the book, which is called Between Pacific Tides. So tides are the factor, and what he's interested in looking at the community structure between the low tide and the high tide. And so is the three organizational frameworks that were now available to Ricketts. The substrate led to the habitat type of analysis. Wave shock provided the upper and the lower, and then tidal patterns created the diversity between the tide marks. Now this was all imagined. He had observed, he made the observations, and he made the link but he had done no systematic observations. However, while he's gone, Willis Hewitt had the tide paper, and Ricketts said, "Would follow up on this, would you?" And so he did a 4-year study, longitudinal study, from the mean low water to mean high water, right in front of Hopkins Marine Station, and he confirmed Ricketts' imagination about the importance of the tides. Well, Between Pacific Tides came out in 1939. There were 1,000 copies that were published, and by 1941 it was out of print. And I can tell you, again, if you don't think that there was an influence on, at least at the scientific community, at least the teaching scientific community, most of the letters to Stanford University Press about when there's an expedition coming out came from people who taught zoology or marine biology. So I'm about to say, this is what the family looked like. This is Uncle Fred, who is married to Ricketts' sister Frances, and to his left, or to your right, is Ed Jr., and on the left, that's Nancy, the daughter. And Ed Jr. died about 2 years ago, but I had a chance to meet him and spend lots of time with him talking about his dad. And then Nancy's still alive in Sitka, Alaska, the same thing. She's a real treasure for his story. And Cornelia is the shortest one, and that's Ed's mom, who also worked in the supply house. Okay. All right, there was a fire in 1936, as I mentioned, and this is the ramshackle replacement. And it wasn't prettied up at all. This is what it looked like just before they built the aquarium down in Monterey, and it still looks very similar to this. Well, anyway, Ricketts' second imaginative venture related to considering the intertidal life as a community. And this, again, came from Bengtsson. There's a German tradition in biology from Carl Moebius with a concept called biosynosis, which is basically about the interrelationship of organisms living together. This has been reinterpreted by Bengtsson along with a Danish benthic biologist, C.G.J. Pedersen, as marine sociology, which I love, because of course this is the beginning of sociology, is in the 1920s and 1930s. Well, again, this is the same time, 1930, when Ricketts is working with tides with Bengtsson and Steinbeck and Campbell and others. And we know this because we'll see, Campbell went on the trip in 1932. When Ricketts starts talking about community structure, he says, and let me quote from Joseph Campbell, who wrote up what Ricketts was talking to him about. So it's a real collaborative effort between these individuals. You don't have to imagine that. That actually occurred. So the trip to Alaska was also important, and then the last piece was the exposure to Cabrera's law of ecological incompatibility, which basically claims that related animal forms are ecologically incompatible, and the incompatibility is more profound the more directly they are related, and one will outcompete the other one, is basically the idea. But when the Between Pacific Tides was sent to press in 1935 or very early 1936, marine sociology and community structure weren't mentioned at all. And part of that was because the fire had just occurred. There wasn't time to revise, and then there weren't any notes to revise from. So they just kept the original version. But we know that Ricketts was trying to incorporate these ideas because he snuck in a zoological introduction to the final version of Between Pacific Tides. And one just brief selection of this was, Ricketts states, the distribution of Pacific littoral invertebrates within a given region is seen in the light of competition and interrelation between the animals themselves. Interrelation seems to be pretty much the keynote of modern holistic concepts, wherein the whole consists of animal or the community and its environment, the notion of relation being significant. So we're moving away from the physical features and now looking at the biological features of community structure. And this, we know that these ideas came from Bengtsson because in 1933, Ricketts writes to Bengtsson and says, he was trying to get Bengtsson to meet Steinbeck when Steinbeck was going to go to Sweden. And he said, Steinbeck's project treatment is a novel form of the group motivating force, the race, and by that he means reference to species, not racial connotations at the time. The race and consciousness, the holism that he calls the flanks, and maybe you've read about that in Steinbeck, those who've read Steinbeck. Sort of a literary summation of some of the ideas, again this is Ricketts, some of the ideas of Ali, Spengler, C.J. Jung, Whitman, D.H. Lawrence, Robinson Jeffers. I have been reading Jung's 2 essays, especially the last, which I think goes very well, exceedingly difficult for me at least. He seems to pioneer a new realm, very much needed, hard to see why someone hasn't discovered it before. And part of this was the role of the unconscious and in this kind of interaction of specimens or communities of organisms together. So that when the book came out, Ricketts tried to get the introduction in. W.K. Fisher read it and said, you know, this is too metaphysical. You got to leave that stuff out. So it never made it in. But it didn't disappear. Here's a picture of Ricketts in his new digs. I don't want to force an interpretation on you, but have you seen a picture of Ricketts yet where he's disheveled? And I know often people pose for pictures, but so this is just a couple of laboratory shots, and everything's neat and tidy. And here's another one of these are individual specimens that schools would order. Well, it's now clear, even though the book didn't include any of the ideas, that Ricketts was a devotee of marine sociology. And I wanted to read a couple more quotations before we get to the final here. So he's waiting for the book to come out, and he writes, the tendency towards excessive reproduction being universal and overcrowding being what it is, the result is that insufficient food or attachment space or oxygen postulates a struggle for existence among the potentially tremendous numbers. And only the animals well adapted to the environment survive through being able to fulfill even their minimal needs. Now, again, I don't know if he read Origin of Species, but he certainly has incorporated all those ideas. And I don't think I need to emphasize, this is the first time this kind of understanding of the intertidal community that I've ever seen. And it's this guy who doesn't have a university education. Well, these ideas were part of this larger community of friends. And Ricketts goes on to state that he borrowed some of the exact wording for the preface from Joseph Campbell. And that is, let me quote from Campbell, that Ricketts is actually quoting. Thus, progressively, the tendency would be for environmental limiting factors to select out a society of species physically fitted to survive the imposed conditions, and for the consequently established society to reinforce its own supremacy by crowding out and eating exotic creatures adapted to other conditions. Now that was a piece that was composed on the Grampus in 1932. So we know who was talking about these ideas at that time. Well, I'm going to skip just a little bit, and although it's incredibly interesting stuff. There's even a selection where Ricketts is talking about how animals are in dubious battle. Where does that come from? Steinbeck's novel, In Dubious Battle, from 1936. And the essay was composed in 1937. So, they're in the kitchen talking about these notions. Well, the next thing we need to talk about is not the last expedition, but the second to the last expedition that Ricketts took. And this was in the summer of 1940. Steinbeck had written Grapes of Wrath in 1939. He won the Pulitzer Prize for that. He gave $1,000, the $1,000 prize, to Richie Lovejoy. Gave all the money away. So again, it reinforces the community nature of these individuals. And then Steinbeck, with the earnings on the book, leased the Western Flyer, and he took along his wife Carol and Ricketts and a crew for a 6-week expedition into the Sea of Cortez. And this was memorialized in a book published by the same title, The Sea of Cortez. And I'll be very careful, it's a Sea of Cortez. Many of you may know the log of the Sea of Cortez, but the Sea of Cortez is basically a scientific book. It's filled with taxonomy, pictures of organisms, and then a description of the collecting, and then some very nice prose discussions of their activities aboard. Now let me just read a brief selection of that, because the final prose that was published was written by Steinbeck, but the source of it was from the notebooks that Ricketts kept. This statement is as following. Consider the relationships between the individual animal and others of the same species, individually or in mass, between the individual and the individuals and groups of individuals of other species, enemy and mate and fellow traveler, between the animal and its inanimate environment. Only one large thesis can be stated with any degree of certainty, the idea of hierarchy. Rank behind rank, societies stand in mutual interdependence, from the most minute and ephemeral bacteria to diatoms, clear up to fish, seals, and whales. Each rank is supported by the abundance of smaller and more transient creatures under it. Each higher order, instead of including the ranks of individuals below, is actually ruled by them. Each rank is completely at the mercy of its subjects, dependent on their abundance or accessibility. All the schemes which our social order prides itself on having discovered have been in use by societies of marine animals far back into the dim geological past. The units comprising human society very commonly say one thing and be another. Not the least of the many values of marine sociology is the fact that the sea animals can only be themselves. It's just great stuff. Anyway, the Sea of Cortez came out, and I want to just indulge me to read a couple of letters from Henry Miller to Ricketts, and then from Joseph Campbell to Ricketts. So Henry Miller, for those of you who aren't Trump fans, you might find some resonance in this. I repeat what I told you face to face. What I told you face to face. You are one of the rare souls on the earth. I know men when I meet them. My trip, otherwise so futile, about America, I mean, was worth it for meeting you and one or two others. The country is vast and empty. The most depressing country I know of. I loathe it. And then he goes on in a more optimistic sense. He goes, your book came a couple of days ago, and I have dipped into it here and there to get the swell of it. It seems like a wonderful book. I can scarcely believe my eyes. I mean, that one never expects to find such books readable. but it's exciting. It's the sort of food literary men need. And then Joseph Campbell is just one of the greatest testaments about who Ricketts really is. He says, "I simply have to tell you how much I enjoyed reading Sea of Cortez. The dominant theme of the work is emerging, and from this remark and from that, we understand that society itself is an organism, that these little intertidal societies and the great human societies are manifestations of common principles. More than that, we understand that the little and the great societies are themselves units in a sublime, all-inclusive organism which breathes and goes on in dreamlike half-consciousness of its own life process, oxidizing its own substance, yet sustaining its wonderful form." Ed, it's a great book, dreamlike, and with no end of implications, sound implications, all sustaining implications. Everything from the beer cans to the phyletic catalog is singing with the music of the spheres. And it should do something to help the critics discover the standpoint which John has been writing his books. And for those of you who've studied at all Steinbeck's relationship with Ricketts, there's an English professor by the name of Richard Astro who wrote in 1976 that the arrow doesn't go from Steinbeck to Ricketts, it goes from Ricketts to Steinbeck. And then Eric Tam points out that after Ricketts' death in 1948, Steinbeck never wrote a notable work. That all of his notable works were written, the best ones were written when he was in company of Ed Ricketts. Well, I'm just going to make one more comment about this because I think it's getting a little bit late. The Sea of Cortez is filled with these illusions between animal communities and human societies. So that's where the tie-in of people like, I don't think Campbell was necessarily interested in a phyletic catalog, but he's interested in the connections that would tie into this notion of myth and consciousness and so forth. And the same with people like Henry Miller. How do you get to the subconscious motivation of people? Well, you look at these animals and look at how they're behaving, and then you can make the bridge. So that was really interesting for them. But I just wanted to again emphasize Ricketts' debt to Bengtsson. This is in 1946, just before he comes up and takes another trip, let's see, to Vancouver Island. He says, "The question of ecology is animals versus other animals. They can overcome pretty nearly any environmental hazard. Only thing they can't do is overcome environmental hazards in the face of other animals who got there first and who fight every inch of the newcomer," which is why Bengtsson wisely refers to the subject as marine sociology. Well, in 1945 and in 1946, Ricketts came north. One trip was to Vancouver Island. He took the Princess Maquina from Victoria all the way to the north of Vancouver Island. And the next summer he went up to Sitka and then took the ferry to Prince Rupert, and then took the ferry out to Masset and back. It's the Vancouver trip that was most productive for him. Let me just point out something to you. Maybe a lot of you have been here, but this is Barking Sound, and I can't even remember, Euclulet, not Euclulet, it's like Euclulet. That's this inlet right here. And there's a place on it right there called Kuldanan. I'd been working on this project for a number of years, and I was in my boat and I saw Kuldanan, and I thought, well, it looks like there's some shallow areas, so I threw my anchored out on it. And didn't think anything about it. Next year I was looking at some manuscripts, and there's the Kuldanan Cannery. That's Ricketts and his girlfriend Toni Jackson at the time in 1946 or 1945 visiting. Well, I had anchored right on the top of it. It had burned down, of course, in the time. I thought, geez, somebody's telling me that I need to do some work on this guy because it's just too much too many coincidences. And this is Ricketts and a woman by the name of Betty Farmer working at low tide on the north end of Vancouver Island. And this is Ed Ricketts right around the same time, actually a little early, probably 1942. Anyway, the trips to Vancouver Island and the Queen Charlotte makes up his the part of the outer shores, and that would have been the third book. The second book was the book of Central America, and that was Mexico and Central America. That was the Sea of Cortez. The outer shores was never completed. There's manuscripts of it, so we don't know what the structure of it was. But what we do know was that in 1948, the last edition, the book came out after he was killed, but he sent it off a couple months before then. So this is his mature version of the book. The text itself was unchanged except for correcting a species or two. But he added a section on plankton. And at the end of plankton, he included an interesting 2-paragraph statement. And I think you'll recognize this from the zoological preface that was trying to get into the 1935 thing. He says, only one large thesis can be stated with any degree of certainty. The idea of hierarchy is implicit. Rank behind rank, societies stand in mutual interdependence, from the most minute and ephemeral bacteria to diatoms, clear up to fish. Then it'll go down. The units comprising human society very commonly say one thing and be another. Not the least of many values of marine sociology is the fact that the sea animals can only be themselves. So he got it in finally in 1948, and it was in the third edition that Hedgepeth edited. Now, one final comment about the Sea of Cortez, and then I'll conclude. You notice that I tried to be real specific that there's a Sea of Cortez and there's a log of the Sea of Cortez. The Sea of Cortez never sold well. It's a big, thick thing like this. And a publisher in New York State came out with the original plates and republished it. And I have that copy. It's really quite a beautiful book, but it was very expensive at the time. When Ricketts was killed, Steinbeck decided that he was going to come out with an edition of it. So he took out all the taxonomy, all the pictures of organisms, rewrote things a little bit, and then added a preface called About Ed Ricketts. And he writes about Ed Ricketts, the guy on the Sea of Cortez, exactly like he was Doc in Cannery Row. Everything, they're just kind of mirror images. What's that? He was crossing a railroad crossing, and it's a kind of a blind curve, and probably the sun was in his eyes too, and he got onto the crossing just as the Del Monte Express was coming by. It wasn't going fast, but you don't have to be fast in a train, and it hit him, and he died 3 days later in the hospital. But anyway, in 1951 or 1950, Steinbeck wanted to reproduce the book, and so he came out with a log of the Sea of Cortez. Now, the family had rights over the Sea of Cortez, and so the publisher had to go to the family to get the rights. And so Ed Jr. and Nancy said, well, they thought it would be only fair if they would get 25%, because, you know, it's only taking things out of the book, not adding much. And the publisher refused, and they got 10%. So to this day, the Ricketts family doesn't say very nice things about John Steinbeck. Well, the concluding comment is that it seems to me that the notion of imagination is compelling and I think very interesting as a framework to explain Ricketts' creativity in marine biology. Importantly, the direction of intertidal ecology following World War II, right after 1948, of course, was decidedly in the tradition suggested by Ricketts. The major marine ecologists from this period included J.H. Connell, Robert Payne from the University of Washington, and his students Paul Dayton at Scripps, Bruce Menge and Jane Lubchenco, both at Oregon State. And if you look up all these names, you'll be impressed by the number of MacArthur Fellows. And there's an International Ecology Prize that's given. 2 or 3 of them have won, or the other, or both. Well, I'd like to conclude by reading a very brief selection from Paul Dayton in 2016 about Ricketts. He said, Ed Ricketts completely changed the course of intertidal ecology in the Eastern Pacific by focusing his questions on the most relevant natural history, and almost all productive scientists relied on between Pacific tides to define their research questions. For this reason, Between Pacific Tides may be the most important intertidal ecology publication ever written. Thank you.
It's a great story. It's going to make a fascinating book. We're pretty much out of time here, but I'm conscious that